I'm Dave Laird.
I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Tim Personn. I'm a German immigrant from in Canada, and I like books that make me laugh and then make me ask, wait, what? And I hope to talk about that here in the Great Concavity with you guys.
Nice. Right on, Tim. Well, welcome everybody to episode. This is 41. We're getting there. Hey, Matt.
41.
41. That's pretty good. We have a very special guest tonight, Tim Personn, who's a friend of mine here in Victoria, British Columbia. And this is cool because usually when we record episodes, it's just me by myself in a room. Matt's by himself in a room in Austin, and wherever our guest is by themselves in a room, all connected on Skype. But this time you're here in my living room, at my kitchen table. So
it's very cozy here.
It's very cozy. Yeah. It's worked out very well. So Tim is someone that I think we've gone out 3 times or so to hang out,
right?
And meet for Wallace beers in Victoria, and it's been great hanging out and talking about literature and philosophy with you. That's a big part of your background.
Right.
So we'll fill in details like that. Tim is a recent doctor. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Graduating here from the University of Victoria in British Columbia. He's originally, as he said, from Hamburg, Germany. He's a writer, translator, musician. He plays in a band called Grimwood. They're playing next Friday.
Yeah, next Friday.
At Wheelies in Victoria.
Yeah.
If you're around, if you're a local citizen, come check that out. He also holds a state examination degree in philosophy and English from, help me out here, Universität Hamburg.
Universität Hamburg.
Oh, yeah, there you go. That's better. In 2010. And then since 2015, he's been teaching here as a lecturer in Victoria, and where he completed his PhD, as we mentioned, in a very cool acronym called CSPT, which stands for Cultural, Social, and Political Thought, which is in July you finished. You defended your dissertation successfully.
End of July,
and your thesis or your dissertation is mainly what we'll talk about tonight. Yeah. And it's called Fictions of Proximity, the Wallace Nexus in Contemporary Literature, which is a title that I really dig. That's cool. Great. Incidentally, your external reviewer was who?
Jeffrey Sievers.
Jeff Sievers, who is a familiar character on this show for listeners. He's been a guest and was also my external reviewer for my work. So that's a very cool connection. So Tim, again, welcome. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Very happy to be here.
And your supervisor, Christopher Douglas, he was on a panel with me at ALA, the American Literature Association this year.
That's right.
So it's a very small community. We all sort of know each other, I feel like.
Yes.
But speaking of proximities.
That's right.
I think anyone who does work on David Foster Wallace in British Columbia, I think knows about all the 4 people who also work on David Foster Wallace in British Columbia. Jeff Sievers being one of the main ones.
That's right. Speaking of which, since being back in Canada since mid-August, we've been home from New Zealand. The last time we recorded, Matt, I was in New Zealand, so it's been a little while. We apologize for the large gap between episodes here. But twice I've got to go out with Wallace folks since being home. A couple weeks ago I was in Vancouver, and Parquet Courts played, and Aveline Hilda and Michelle Martin and Nicholas Noble and my friend Nathan Shep, we went to a place called Taco Fino for dinner, and Andrew Savage from Parquet Courts joined us. So we had a pre-concert taco fest
So
together.
I have to interject just there is that the tacos are better in Austin.
Yeah, I'm sure it's true.
And the Parquet Courts is in Austin tonight, playing at the Austin City Limits Festival.
And why are you talking to us right now?
I would rather be here doing this podcast. You know?
Right.
I'm more of a reader, a music person.
Well,
but a lot of people I know, they're playing to a huge crowd. I mean, it's got to be like 100,000 people down at this festival. It's a
that's
huge
big.
festival.
That is huge for them too, right?
It's a huge festival, and Parquet Courts is in town, probably eating tacos right now somewhere.
post-show.
Post-show.
Yeah, Andrew in the emails leading up to the event was very skeptical of British Columbia taco joint, and I assured him that while they may not be authentic, Tex-Mex or Mexican, there's a West Coast taco vibe that's done very well here. I eat at Taco Fino in Victoria pretty often, like once every week or two usually.
Nice.
And he was pleasantly surprised. He said to me at the end that like, okay, I'm on board. It's good. So that was cool. And then I guess was it last weekend, Tim? We went to Shazia Fiz Ramji's
I think it was 2 weeks
poetry
ago.
reading.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all blurring together
Yeah.
for me. Life's been really hectic. Shazia, who was a guest on episode 32, I believe, Matt. She had a poetry reading here in Victoria. She was launching her book, Port of Being. And Tim and I took that in, as well as listener Hannah Mune Henderson. Mm-hmm. And we went out for drinks after with a few other of the poets that read. And we went to the James Joyce pub.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was pretty apt for where the conversation went.
Yes.
A lot of Wallace talk. And I got to say, Shazia's book is phenomenal. I got home that night and read the whole thing, cover to cover, until 2 a.m. or something. Yeah. And you can get that from Invisible Press. We'll link to where you can buy that in the show notes. So huge shout out to Shazia for gaining up the courage to do like a massive book tour across Canada and just really, really crushed it. So that was great. I heard a joke recently. What do you call 3 white dudes in a room talking?
A podcast.
A podcast. Yeah. So that's the theme of tonight's episode.
All right.
3 dudes almost all together in a room. It's a podcast.
We fulfill the criteria, right?
We do, yeah. We all have beards, fairly short beards. Matt's is probably the longest right now. I just shaved recently.
I'm gearing up. Well, I'll save that. I think at our end of year wrap up, I will have more to say about podcasts. Like I've probably listened to more other podcasts this year than any other like type of media I have consumed except for books.
Mm-hmm. That sounds about right for you.
I think the line between what is a podcast and what is, I don't know, radio
Talk
or
radio,
what is,
yeah.
All of those lines are going to blur in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So
I guess the difference is that like podcasts are just self-published, right? So anyone can put one out.
Mm-hmm. But the quality, I mean,
Sure.
There's a huge difference in like
Yeah.
the top 1% of podcasts.
Yeah. Of which we are clearly. So congratulations to us.
I'd put us in the top half.
Top half. Yeah, that seems about right. Yeah. I've heard some that are much worse off quality wise, like audio quality wise than ours. So we're doing okay. We're middle of the road. Speaking of which, we've been at this for 3 years this month. This is our third anniversary. October 2015 was our first episode. So this is like our birthday episode with you, Tim. So welcome to the party.
Cheers.
And thanks everyone for hanging in with us this long. It's been really cool.
Yeah, it's a big milestone because I'm not great at, well, whatever. It's a good milestone, but I want to do more. I feel like we need to do more episodes, and one of my goals starting now is to do more. We have a couple of other episode ideas in the pipeline, and we have a bunch of things that hopefully, if they work out, we'll have even more exciting stuff in the future, and not these huge gaps in between episodes. I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, we used to be kind of like every 2 or 3 weeks was our average, and we've kind of slowed down a little bit to like once a month on average in the last 6 months. And part of that's been like life stuff with me in New Zealand, but yeah, I think if we can hit every 3 weeks or so, that's pretty good. Get back to where we were. No signs of slowing down though. That's not in the agenda at all. So yeah.
So I want to get Tim in the mix here.
Let's get Tim
and
way in the mix here.
Tim, why don't you start out by telling us, you have a pretty unique background for people we've interviewed. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you discovered Wallace? Was it when you were in Germany, or what was that like for you as a student? Were you in university when you first read him? What's your story?
Yeah, I thinking about that today, I remembered that I had first encountered Wallace in a small German literary magazine, or a zine really just, and it was, I forget the title, but they published a translation of the Marxen essay together with, I believe, a translation of Girl with Curious Hair in German under Mädchen mit komischen Haaren. And then they also added a few pages from the Marxen book from Wittgenstein's Mistress. And that was my introduction to Wallace. So it really kind of prefigured how I came to his work, from a very philosophical angle. And very much along the lines of some of the thoughts he's developing in the Marxen essay. So that's how I first encountered him, really through this sort of German literary avant-garde there, not through university at all. And then I was lucky enough to be able to study in Boston for a year, and I think that was around that time when I actually ended up purchasing Infinite Jest, and as with so many people, it ended up sitting on my bookshelf for a while.
So you weren't walking the streets,
not
mapping
yet.
the territory?
No, that came later. I had other things to read, and I completed that year in grad school there, and then went back to Germany, and then I actually started thinking about reading Wallace, and I ended up doing a master's thesis or a state examination thesis with my German supervisor on Wallace too. But I actually ended up reading Infinite Jest on a train ride from Boston to San Francisco.
Oh, yeah?
Halfway through, I got stuck in Chicago for a couple of days, and I think that delay just gave me enough time to really get into the book. And so unlike some other people who started but then never finished, I had enough time just sitting around on the train to actually read it. And
did you finish it on the train from when you left and started?
Almost. I think
Really?
I had 200 pages left after that.
That's cool. That's like the fastest I've ever heard.
Oh, well, like I said, you just sit on the train.
Yeah, you had a good
just
situation for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think the whole Gately sequence at the end, I think I read that a little later.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was after that. And then I ended up doing graduate work on Wallace here in Victoria as well, and decided I wanted to do the dissertation on him primarily, but I also wanted to do a multi-author dissertation, and then just thought, wouldn't it be cool if I just looked at sort of the constellation of people in his proximity or vicinity, or even a little bit more remote, but everything being held together by sort of the idea of it being a large conversation about literature and philosophy. And so that's a little bit of my background.
And when you were first encountering him, what kind of other American writers, or what was your what other things were you into? Were you sort of, did he fit well into your wheelhouse, or was it something not really that would initially interest you?
Oh, he fit in really well. I was a huge Don DeLillo fan. I'd probably read everything by DeLillo after I graduated high school in Germany. My dad gave me a copy of all his books, and I just read the whole, almost the entire
dad.
Yeah, cool dad. Thanks, Dad. I'm not sure he's listening, but so I was really into DeLillo, and I think that was probably what opened my eyes to Wallace too.
Yeah, that's my gateway too.
Yeah,
White
great.
Noise.
Yeah, exactly. White Noise, in particular, Underworld, Libra, and then the later stuff. I really like the body artist too. It's such a compressed little work. But I love DeLillo. I even went to see him read in Hamburg around the time. And got him to sign a copy of Cosmopolis. And so that was really my entry into American literature, even though that's also what I ended up studying in Hamburg. But it was really DeLillo and some other postmodernists. I started reading Pynchon, but I came to Pynchon more through Wallace. DeLillo was my first love, really. And then I sort of, step by step, after people had heard that I liked DeLillo, I got the recommendations for Wallace. And I remember there was a German literary magazine at the time that had a short piece on Wallace and called him sort of the future of American fiction. And I felt like I had to check that out. That's the future. I need to be privy to that.
If it's about tennis and drugs,
that's pretty much it. Yeah.
So did you grow up in Germany? Were you a native German speaker?
Yes, I grew up in Germany, and then as a high school student, I spent a year in Connecticut when I was 16. And then after that, I came back to Germany and then did a year in Boston when I was in my mid-20s. Yeah, and then came back to it. Was sort of a back and forth over the years, and yeah.
So after you had read them, did you read him in translation, or did you get the English?
It was in translation, which is really interesting. Cool. Especially in retrospect for a writer like Wallace, where language matters so much, right? And where I admire the language so much. I feel it's interesting that I my first exposure was through translation. But it didn't, especially because I really started by reading the Marxist essay. I don't think it mattered that much because, that essay, of course, has a very unique style too, but the ideas really were interesting to me at the time, especially the whole idea of literature as a literalization of philosophical themes, and in a way that the philosophy can't convey it because it doesn't speak to the body and the heart the same way that fiction can. Yeah. So, but then I very quickly started reading. When I started reading Infinite Jest, I realized, you have to read Wallace in the original, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so you've since read Infinite Jest in English?
I've only read it in English. There's a German translation that came out a few years back, I think by a guy named Blumenthal. But I have not read that, actually.
Blumenbach.
Thank you. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So you read Infinite Jest in English the first time, but you read the Wittgenstein Empty Planet in German.
It's just that one German literary magazine that
I thought you were meaning that you read Infinite Jest in German first. And I was like, oh, wow, that's fascinating.
No, it was in English, yeah.
Cool.
I haven't... that was the only Wallace in translation that I read, was that first exposure. After that, I switched to the English.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So Ulrich Blumenbach, who translated Infinite Jest into German, und Endlicher Spaß.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Wow, bravo.
Yeah.
I believe that he also translated The Pale King into German as well. And my understanding is he did a very good job, and he did post on our Wallace email list several times about asking for interpretations of things that were a little less literal.
That is amazing.
And this has happened with many translators, just because Wallace does so many idiosyncratic things that are not really translatable strictly. So I think it's always interesting to see how translators deal with it, and usually the ones who put a lot of thought and time and effort into it end up with a better product. And I know you said in your bio that you have been a translator too, so I wanted to ask you about what's your experience with that I assume you're going from English to German, is that correct?
No, I actually ended up translating from German to English. I've done a couple of smaller projects. The biggest translation project I've done was a big monograph that my supervisor in philosophy published in Germany a few years back. In German, it's called Der Begriff des Arguments, and it was translated as the concept of argument, or I translated it as that. And it's actually a book of philosophy, but it's written in a way that I think it has belletristic elements. It's not a very analytical work in that sense. So I felt like it was almost like translating fiction or literature at times, at least, and it was very fascinating to do that. And it really, in some ways, almost changed my thinking a little bit about the status of language. But yeah, I admire what literary translators do, because, like you say, it's such a monumental effort to not only move the language, but kind of move the whole contextual apparatus that gives the language a meaning, right? And you got to shift it from one cultural setting to another. And I remember that at Blumenbach, I thank you for reminding me of the name, Matt. I remember reading that he somewhere wrote that he even changed dialects. So I think the scene in Infinite Jest where there's a character with a sort of Irish inflection, he changed that to a Bavarian dialect, right?
Oh, really?
Which I think so, yeah. And I might be wrong, but I remember this is what he wrote at the time. And to me, that was...
It's the guy that talks about having a turd with a pulse?
That's that guy? I think so, yeah, exactly, right? And now change that to a Bavarian slang, right? And wow, I think it's radical, and in many ways, it's probably the only way you can really translate fiction, right?
Yeah. That's an interesting aspect of it that I've never considered before. Yeah. I know that Robin O'Neill on her podcast, Me Reading Stuff, always talks about how translators are her biggest literary heroes. She always is shouting out oh, this is by my favorite translator, says his name. What translating really, in some ways, changed for me was to think about this shift between two contexts. And before I was very much under the sway of some deconstructionist and phenomenological ways of thinking, in which language is such a key anchor and door really to reality, and translating thoughts from one language to another really made me think that there is something there that I'm shifting from one
if you will, context or one text to another, and this something that's being moved there has to be some entity of sorts, right? So I really felt a little challenged in my own ways of thinking about the sort of transcendental status of language, because if there's something you can express in two different languages, that something has to have its status on its own, you know what I mean? So I felt very challenged in my normal ways of how I was sort of raised intellectually to think about language, when you realize, okay, if I can think about how something would be perceived in that one language and whether it would adhere to a standard set up that I have sort of in my head, well, then that standard has to express something, right? And so I don't know. I really, it's not that I really still believe that language has, you know, this sort of door function to how we perceive reality, but this pushed back in my own head, you know. It was kind of interesting as an experience.
Well, Tim, I believe there's inherent value in that. That's one thing. It's super frustrating where, you know, there's market demands on translations who can get something published or not. That really determines like our whole language's access to that work. Yeah. And this, I think, is related also to Wittgenstein's Mistress, right? Where it was rejected like 45 times, 54 times. Yes. and you know, it was really like, even the people who thought that it was valuable and important said, oh, well, it'll never sell. Yeah. And, you know, there's this other part where to be a good translator, you sort of also have to be a savvy business person in some ways, you know. And it's the same with any writer, especially of experimental literature. But, you know, I think we're all deeply indebted to the people who did take the risks, you know, and the people and the translators who put a lot of effort into. One thing we have not talked about on the podcast is Bottom's Dream, which is Arno Schmidt.
Oh, we've talked about it.
I'm familiar about that. I've talked about it as like an interesting thing, but like actually talking about the work is almost impossible. Right, yeah. But like the kind of work that goes into that, and that's also published by Dalkey Archive, which. You know, John O'Brien, who is still the publisher of Dalkey Archive, and Stephen Moore, who was an editor there for a long time, really brought in Wittgenstein's Mistress. Yeah. And those guys are both still around, and I hope they're still listening to this podcast. And, you know, we're thankful to them for, like, being the ones to actually put money, you know, next to an important work of art, which, you know, to me it just points up like what other things did not get published because they were not funded.
Right.
But I'm really curious about going back to your take on encountering Markson and Wallace together in a sort of philosophical context. Can you give us a little bit about like where you were coming from like a philosophical point of view at that time, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess then as now, I was very much a Wittgensteinian. That's sort of my own introduction to philosophy. I studied philosophy in Hamburg, and it was a very analytical department in the sense that they would teach a lot of contemporary analytical philosophers, but there was always Wittgenstein as this sort of, you know, hard to classify presence among all the other analytical philosophers. And I fell in love with it, and I still believe it's one of the best ways to learn how to do philosophy, is to sort of follow the convoluted thoughts of that man, you know, in his major books, and then try to come up with answers of your own. And that was sort of my frame of mind at the time. And paired with that, I was also trying to do some fiction of my own, and I was really trying to synthesize the two approaches. On the one hand, thinking deeply about philosophy and existential questions, but on the other hand, also trying to create art out of that, you know. So you can probably already tell that, you know, like finding Wallace was just, you know, kind of eye-opening to me, because in many ways that's what he's writing about in The Empty Plenum, right? But my own I think that was my introduction to Wallace, this idea of how can we literalize or fictionalize or dramatize these philosophical questions in ways that make them an experience rather than state them as an assertion, right? So I was very intrigued by his approach of literalizing, as he calls it there, the theoretical axioms of the Tractatus, and turning it into a literary experience that can help you understand the kind of metaphysics and worldview that Wittgenstein is trying to outline there. And in my opinion, this also really gets to even what Wittgenstein himself was trying to do at the end of the tractate, is when he kind of reverses direction and says, you have to throw away the ladder after you've climbed up on it. And in some ways, I think that experience of moving upwards, throwing away the ladder, that kind of affective experience of how you relate emotionally to the philosophy is, I think, also what Wallace was trying to get at in that early essay. And then I personally don't think that he ever really gave up on that approach to fiction, but of course that's debatable.
The broom of the system.
That's even before, right?
Yeah,
totally. And he has called that a dialogue between Derrida and Wittgenstein too, right?
Yeah.
So it was always already there, I think. For me, it was probably it came to me at the right time in my life because I was also trying to synthesize these strands.
You're right.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, and I think it's interesting that Marxen became the one to put Wittgenstein in the title of a book, when ultimately I think he's far less interested in Wittgenstein and philosophy in general than Wallace was, and I think what he's doing there is much more metaphorical, as you said, as something greater to do with art and sort of his own interests, which I haven't read the chapter in your dissertation entirely about, but I want to get into that because I think it's super interesting.
Cool.
The stuff about silence, I mean, the demand for silence. I mean, for people who haven't read it, like, I don't know if you can give us like a 1-minute summary of what is that book about, but go for it.
Well, I can try. I mean, I think the book is highly ambiguous in what it's about, and in part that's the point, right? I think what we find there is a woman who's sitting on a beach at a typewriter and trying to write a novel, which is kind of an anti-novel in the sense that there's no plot to it and no characters because of the way she perceives the world, which is to say that she doesn't know whether she's completely alone or whether there are still people out there. At any rate, she can't find any kind of source of other people at anywhere,
This is Kate.
This is Kate, yeah. And so to me that was fascinating in so many ways because first of all the question comes up, is she mad or is she sane? Is it really true that no one's left? If that's the case, how did it happen? And I think the ambiguities of the text never really clarifies that for us. It sort of disseminates.
It's like a post-apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly, right? It has a bit of a post-apocalyptic tinge to it, but then that never really plays out except in the sense that the world is empty and all is left is just objects, and even animals are sort of in most cases an illusion, and she never gets any kind of another quote-unquote soul to relate to. And I found the ambiguities to be quite interesting, and I think Marxen in an interview himself said that this way of writing allowed him to get at much more multifaceted question of reality and how we can be certain about reality than he would have been able to dramatize in the way he first started out doing the story, because he first wrote I think about 125 pages of a more straightforward kind of a post-apocalyptic narration, like what's going on. And after that, he discarded that and just jumped right into in medias res, jumped into the story. And we're kind of faced with the same questions and ambiguities Kate is faced with. And I think to me, it's really a very sustained meditation on our limitations as human beings, and I think that the situation that Kate finds herself in is a beautiful metaphor, and I think Wallace and Marx and both probably took it the same way, of our attempts at knowing other people and knowing the world, but never having the kind of certainty around that can actually lead to being completely validated in what we consider to be knowledge, right? There's always a nagging doubt, if you will. And so I really thought this was a very interesting starting point for connecting that particular work that Wallace was interested in the late 80s with some of the thoughts on skepticism that he was also interested in around that time, namely especially those by his one-time teacher Stanley Cavell, and he did that short time at Harvard trying to study under Cavell, and it didn't really work out, but to me it always suggests that there was this confluence of interests in him with Marxen and Cavell, and then around the same time, also writing the essays like the Marx in Review essay. And I thought of this period in Wallace's life as quite decisive because it really sort of leads up to his breakdown, but then also synthesizes some of the strands that were really important for him throughout the 80s, and so I thought of this as a good way to start my own dissertation here, because it would sort of create a bit of a large canvas on which I could talk about epistemology and literature and fiction and philosophy and try to
all the big $5 philosophy terms,
totally.
Ontology, all that stuff.
Ontology too.
Remind me. So it's been a while since I read The Empty Plenum, Wallace's review of Marxism. Does he start that with the Anthony Burgess quote that as we are all solipsis and all die, the world dies with us. Only very minor literature aims at apocalypse.
No, I think that's the one on Updike, right?
Oh,
or am I wrong about that?
I can't remember.
Actually,
I know it's somewhere. I know.
I remember this quote. I think I'm pretty sure Wallace quoted it for sure. I think it's in the Great Male Narcissist piece, but I might be wrong. But I think the Empty Plenum starts with a quote by Cavell and by. Yeah, I think it's by Cavell.
Oh, okay.
And that was another hint for me to think about that whole connection to his teacher then. Yeah.
Because that whole plot description you just gave of Wittgenstein's mistress that reminds me so much of that Burgess quote.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, and there's also a whole tradition, of like the Omega Man, which is like the last the last man on Earth.
Is that a video game in the 80s?
It was a movie, and then it was remade with Will Smith, where he's like the last man on Earth.
Like I Am Legend.
I have to watch this.
Yeah, and then there's a comic book I will tell you called that is Jonathan Lethem wrote it.
Oh wow!
And it's about this premise of like the Omega Man, and it. Like I say, there's a long tradition of that, like the last person on Earth, and it's sort of a fantasy that anyone can indulge in. Like, what would it be like if you were the only person on the whole planet? And Marxson does get into kind of the details of like, I think what his character does is like go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and like put up her own paintings.
That's right. Yeah.
Have you guys seen The Last Man on Earth, the TV show?
I have not.
With Will Forte, he's the last man in America. Some event has happened. We don't really know what it is, but he goes around to like major art galleries and just takes all the paintings and puts them in his motorhome, and then like finds a mansion and just puts them up and defaces them, and like it's like the Declaration of Independence as a napkin. Yeah. And in the first episode, like it's really funny.
Yeah, it's a pretty great fantasy, but like Tim says, it quickly emerges in the book that. You're questioning the sanity or reality of the narrator.
Right. Yeah.
So your dissertation, Tim, is really there's 3 other books in there. You want to tell us the big 4 that you built your argument around?
Yeah, it's pretty long. That's true. Well, yeah. I mean, so we started talking about the Wittgenstein's Mistress chapter, where I try to develop this question of how to relate to skepticism, and that one in particular is about the idea of. I primarily discuss it as a meditation on external world skepticism, the entire world as being somewhat unfounded or uncertain. The second chapter then moves that into the realm of interhuman relations. So in that chapter, I tried to focus on American Psycho, because I think that some of the violent excesses in Patrick Bateman's behavior can be read as well as a consequence of an idea of what it would mean to know someone else that is ultimately always foiled, that always fails. And the way that Bateman, to my mind, responds to these failures of knowing another is through violence. So in that chapter, I tried to talk about how other mind skepticism, the idea of whether we can ever know another person, can also be dramatized and literalized through literature. And that allowed me to then also speak about different ways in which Wallace and Ellis talk about how to engage the reader and how to, conceive of the proximity of the reader-writer relationship and the narrator and a reader relationship in different ways, and that lead to my mind, different ways of doing literary ethics, really. And then in the third chapter, I return to a topic that a lot of Wallace scholars have talked about, which is Wallace's relationship to irony, of course. And after I, talked a lot about the sort of epistemological considerations that go into how I personally read Wallace, I also seem to find a way to think in new ways about his relationship with irony. And in that chapter, then I talk about a distinction I make between two different types of irony, which in some ways helped me undermine this idea that Wallace is trying to get us out of irony. And to my mind, that's very much true of an idea of irony as detachment and cynicism. But I also still find his work to be profoundly ironic in ways that I also find Marxism to be ironic. And that is an irony that I think what I would call irony as proximity, that actually is more a source of insight rather than what Wallace might call, a way of hiding. And so that the two epistemological chapters at the beginning on Wittgenstein's Mistress and American Psycho kind of allowed me to revisit Wallace's infinite jest in some ways. And then in the fourth chapter, I focused on someone who comes later, Zadie Smith, who's, I think, profoundly influenced by Wallace, and has said so too, and written about Wallace in that beautiful essay, right? The brief interviews essay. And so in that book, in that chapter, I focused on The Autograph Man, which is a book that has often been called as written under the influence of Americans like Dave Eggers and David Foster Wallace. And so in that book, I talk about her relationship to metaphysics and humor as well. Yeah, so those are my 4 books there, if you will.
Well, obviously, we're most interested in one of those 4 books.
That's right.
But for me, Wittgenstein's Mistress is one that I go back to, and I think I enjoy rereading frequently, and I can dip in and dip out of often, and I like that book as a sort of standby. I don't have a lot to say about American Psycho or The Autograph Man, but I do have a question for you about The Autograph Man, because I heard an interview with Zadie Smith maybe 2 years after that book came out, and I felt like she was sort of disowning in the book the way that that Wallace sort of disowned Broom of the System. And I think it's interesting that was his first book and that was her second book.
Yeah.
But I think there's some parallels and towards their, I don't know if it's truthfulness or honesty or authenticity in those books, but it's something that feels off to me. I was wondering if you felt that.
That's interesting. I don't. What I remember reading was that I forget which essay this was. It's in her first essay collection. Somewhere she recalls rereading her books, and she says having reread The Autograph Man on an airplane, and actually chuckling at times and feeling that it was, an okay work, whereas the other ones she felt almost incapable of rereading because she just felt very embarrassed. So I don't know, maybe it's also about when we reread certain things, what day of, time of day or whatever mood we're in. I don't know. I find, The Autograph Man feels to me very much like apprenticeship work in many ways. She's really trying things there. I personally thought it was fascinating because of some of the intertextual connections to Kafka and Walter Benjamin and thinkers like that I also reference in my dissertation. And the idea of having a conversation between these literary figures sort of allowed me to then look at how do Wallace and Smith, for example, read Kafka, and how do Ellis and Smith relate to Walter Benjamin's reading, and so on and so forth. So that's why I focused on that novel.
I just think there was a lot of reaction to it when it came out as a follow-up to White Teeth, that it was not, Wallace, his follow-up work to Broom of the System was Infinite Jest. And so it's not really a great comparison on my end. But I want to get back to a couple of these ideas, like how they relate, and maybe if we just focus on Marx and Wallace, I will have more to contribute.
Sure.
Or Dave will. Is about the ideas you have about stuckness and silence. Can you summarize how those fit together with these kind of nexus of writers?
Yeah. So the whole idea of silence basically allowed me to contextualize this group, or maybe even this generation of writers, in terms of literary history, I think. So what I tried to do, especially in the introduction, was to be very careful and mindful of how these figures think about silence in their works. And I on the one hand, I think my first exposure to thinking about silence here was through the Marxian essay, where Wallace really talks about what he calls the importance of silence, and how the book doesn't speak loudly but sort of whispers, and is very indirect in the way it's trying to make its points. And so that really first got me to think about the possibilities of gesturing towards silence through literature. And then I realized that even in DeLillo and Pynchon, as two other precursors to Wallace's work, silence plays such an important role. On the one hand, in End Zone, the silences of the desert that Gary Harkness is wandering through, and then in Gravity's Rainbow, you have the silence even at the very end of the book, when we're supposed to hear the group of people chiming in, but that's the end of the book, right? And other moments of silence in that book also really stand out. So I realized that there was this interest among these early postmodernists in, on the one hand, silence as something that is, as Wallace writes in reading End Zone, horror. There's something really horrible about being faced with the undifferentiated chaos that can be silence, right? On the other hand, there also seemed to be something in gesturing towards the plenitude and the fullness of silence that cannot be conveyed through human speech. And when I started thinking about this, I realized that a similar discourse is happening in philosophy at the time, with both Wittgenstein and Heidegger, but also even Adorno and other contemporary philosophers being very interested in silence, on the one hand as I would almost say a continuation of representation by other means, if you will, but then also as an almost moral imperative after the Holocaust, when Adorno writes, after Holocaust, we can't have any more poetry, or we can't have any more art, because all of Western civilization is caught up in metaphysics of presence, as Derrida would say, and is therefore implicated in this drive towards abstraction and this drive towards destruction that comes to its culmination point, in at least how I describe it here, in the Holocaust. But you could also look at the history of colonization, etc. So there seemed to be this double movement looking at the at least two aspects of silence. And I thought that Wallace, especially in the Marx and Peas, was so attuned to how silence can be operative in that work. And so I became really interested in how he maybe uses the silences in his work to speak and to gesture past, the metaphysical enclosure, gesture past the accustomed ways of thinking towards something that is perhaps more encompassing, but then also leads us beyond the word and beyond the written page. And Zadie Smith actually writes somewhere that what Wallace was trying to do was to make something happen off the page, outside language, which is something curious for a thing of literature to do. She writes somewhere, right? And so that, again, confirmed my sense that there's some kind of interest between these authors in the promises and the horrors of silence. And I kind of followed up on that a little bit. And yeah, so that was what.
Well, I thought that was super interesting. I just have to just jump in to say that whenever I first read your abstract, I was like, well, silence as a response to the Holocaust. I thought that was fascinating, because this generation of writers that you're focusing on, I didn't think were responding to that cultural, moment at all. But I had heard similar things about 9/11, and that like, especially in the days after 9/11, it was sort of saying, words have failed. What can we say? There's no response that language can really have here. Like, we have these images that are being replayed over and over, and we sort of need to just wait for a response. And there was a big, Jonathan Safran Foer was a part of this too, of like, Don DeLillo responded to this as like, how do we write a novel that responds to 9/11 And
Steve Erickson, most recently, I guess.
Steve Erickson, the Twin Towers. I mean, a lot of writers, I guess, feel that there's a waiting period and then a response. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you have to let it sink.
It's like
in
they're silent for a bit,
so.
but then not. And like I guess you're making a more like philosophical argument, but can you speak to that a bit?
Well, yeah, I think you're right that we don't really find, at least in Wallace, we don't have, say, a thematization of the Holocaust. You're absolutely right in that regard. I think I'm just thinking here of the one instance that I can remember apart from the non-fictional work that's in the Suffering Channel, I believe, where the 9/11 is sort of teased at the end, where he writes something about one character having only a week or two left to live because they work in the World Trade Center. That one, I think that, and that to me, in its sort of omission of the fact or omission of the event that we all know, speaks to that treatment, that indirect treatment of trauma, I think, as well. But I think that maybe also the ways in which the breakdown of civilization in the Holocaust is finding its way into the work of these writers might be through the theory, and it might be through the ways in which the theorists that people like Wallace read very much respond to the Holocaust, whether it's Derrida or whether it's Adorno. And I mean, I think Derrida can't be overestimated, I think, as a source for Wallace's thinking. So, in that critique of Western metaphysics and critique of metaphysics of presence, I think we also find traces of a critique of the ways of thinking that may have led to the abstraction that can be, can culminate in this kind of objectification of human life that found its, manifestation in the Holocaust. So maybe the theory here is also a way in which we can see them responding indirectly to some of the trends and fashions in thought that came out of that event.
That's fair enough. I also have a question for you about a phrase that you used in one part of your dissertation that I had never. I had to go Google to see what it meant, and I was like, "Well, this is really interesting because I think you're saying the phrase is an aporetic method."
Yes. Yeah.
Aporetic. I don't even know how to say it.
Yeah.
Aporetic.
Yeah. Totally.
And it's like, what? So how are they getting at this? Philosophical concept sort of indirectly, right? That's what this method is.
Yeah, totally. That's right. And my interest in aporia came out of my background in philosophy. So I had studied some Plato, some undergrad work and things like that. So I was familiar with the idea of aporia. And then reading deconstruction, the idea of aporia returns. But I always thought that there was a difference between the ways in which a philosopher like Derrida talks about aporia as a sort of pathless path. I think that's the idea, right? It's a pathless path. I think that's almost a literal translation of it. So I felt like there was something to be said here for making a distinction between I almost want to call it a philosophical use of aporia, the way that we might find it in even early works by philosophers like Plato, and on the other hand, the notion of aporia as it becomes more prevalent than in later deconstructive thought. And my idea and the way I connected to Wallace here was that I think what he's really creating are these cognitive breakdowns, these sort of interference, what's the word? Not that. Yeah, like a cognitive breakdown or a moment where different codes conflict and we can't make sense or we can't make them cohere. And this sort of idea of interference, that's the word I was looking for, interference.
I was going to say dissonance, maybe?
Yeah, dissonance, absolutely. Yeah, cognitive dissonance is another way of describing it, right? I think Tom LeClaire, when he talks about Wallace's work, he said that Wallace is, trying to fuck his readers up in a sense of creating cognitive dissonance. And that was something that made me think of all the moments in Infinite Jest where characters we're leaving them at this point of kind of breakdown, right? Of the inability of making codes or messages or ideas cohere. And I think this inability is very much the experience of aporia, as it kind of runs through a philosophical tradition as well. So when I spoke of a aporetic method, that's kind of what I was getting at, this idea of driving a language to a point of breakdown, and then by doing so, gesturing at something that lies beyond the accustomed vocabularies or accustomed ways of thinking. But like Smith said, something that is in that sense off the page, but that the page would sort of help us get to in that sense, right?
Well, and that makes me think of how, Wallace originally wanted to open Infinite Jest with that scene of Hal and the professional conversationalist, right? And like language is broken down, the inability to really communicate, and he's at a sort of impasse with his father in a verbal sense. And I was really struck by just you using this phrase of stuckness and like a literal stuckness. And there's a lot of that in Infinite Jest. Like, can you give us some more examples?
Well, I start the chapter out with many instances of the tennis players, the younger teenage tennis players, sort of wondering about how to resolve certain things. And the terms Wallace uses often are frozen on this anxiety, or he felt stuck, couldn't get out on either side, whether it's the tennis players or whether it's even characters like Erdedy waiting for his drug dealer. And then at the moment that he hears the doorbell ring for the dealer, he also hears the telephone sound. Then he can't make up his mind which way to go, right? So he gets, I think the formulation is something like splay-legged between the two sound. I forget if that's the actual formulation, but that's another literalization. And we spoke about Marx and literalizing philosophy, right? I think these are images that are also literalizing in an almost Kafkaesque way ideas and thoughts, and are in a funny way are pointing us to something that goes beyond what we see or imagine there, right? So that's another one that I always like to think of as the Erdedy scene where he, moments like that in the book, I think, and I think readers are different, but to me they always point to an idea of needing to move beyond the established ways of thinking here, right? And I think that's the effect of aporia in the philosophical tradition, is that to create a desire for something else. And it is very much in that desire for something else that I see Infinite Jest succeeding, actually. I've always thought about why I love that book so much, and I think it's because it creates something in me, and maybe it creates something in many people who just want to keep reading, or want to keep reading this long work, or want to keep reading literature in general. But this desire to move beyond maybe not being able to stay with that moment of stuckness, right? Even though it is a moment of insight, it's also the horror that Wallace heard in the silence and in End Zone.
Oh, that's super interesting, and I think it applies to a lot of life, and I think that you could...
Just going to throw out a general term here.
It does. Well, it does. It just makes me think that, there's some bit of depression that's framed that way, right? Yeah. That it's like you're stuck, or you're unable to progress, and there are just lots of things that I think Wallace is interested in Hamlet, for example, and that Hamlet's equivocation and inability to really make a decision, although he's very articulate in his inability to make a decision.
I think there's probably something quite meta about Infinite Jest too, and a lot of people's experience reading it is the feeling of stuckness. Yeah, because you don't really feel any tangible sense of progress as you're reading it, except for if you're reading it maybe on a train in 1 week. But like if you spend an hour reading Infinite Jest and you look at where your bookmark is, like wow, what did I just spend my hour doing, reading like 13 pages or something, because it's so dense, and I hit a bunch of endnotes and like got derailed. So maybe there's a meta element to the stuckness, that the reader feels stuck while they're reading it.
I remember two things on that note, and one was that I think in that 20th anniversary forward by Dave Eggers. Where he talks about how just the experience of reading Infinite Jest makes him feel like he's become a better person, because he's sort of stuck with the stuckness, right?
It's like a monasticism element.
Yeah, perhaps, right? Yeah.
And see, I've never felt that. I felt like the people who read it just to like check off something as an accomplishment, like, oh, I climbed Mount Everest, and I, it's like you read Infinite Jest just to say that you did, rather than like treat it like a work of art, which demands something of the reader beyond time.
Yeah.
And I'm just not a big fan of that. I think that it's unfortunate that Infinite Jest gets lumped in. I mean, culturally, at least in our moment on Twitter or whatever, you never hear people bragging about like, oh, well, did you read William Gass's The Tunnel?
That's right.
Or, did you read The Recognitions?
That's right.
Or did you read Bottom's Dream? It's like, no, it's just become shorthand as like, for all these other things, which
like the Ulysses of our time in that sense, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the other thing I was thinking of is Wallace' aims for the book too, and I think he said something in the interviews with Lipsky that he wanted to show readers that they were able to do more than they thought they were able to do. I'm just paraphrasing here, right? And to teach them something about their own willingness to engage and their own willingness to be committed to something, perhaps, and in that sense, I think the book kind of tricks you into that, right? It is, in that sense, the failed entertainment that he wanted it to be, right? Because it's so entertaining, even though it doesn't really lead to that kind of a moment of epiphany, right? It doesn't have that epiphany. But it does teach you something about yourself. At least that's, I think, what Wallace was trying to show, in a sense, right? Yeah.
Well, and I think I've said this on the podcast before, but it's like, in a way, I have been reading this book for like 20 years. And it's like I have never stopped really reading the book. And like, if you treat, I don't know, engagement with art, not necessarily this book, but I think in general, then it makes me think of this other thing that I'm going to throw out there from a philosopher named Kiran Setia. And he wrote a book about like dealing with a midlife crisis through philosophy. It's called Midlife. We'll link to it. But one point that he makes in there is that like you should seek out activities that are what he calls atelic, meaning that they don't really have an end. Telos, right? And they don't really have a goal, or like if you read Infinite Jest and then you finish and you close the book and you walk away, you're like, hey, I did my goal. I did it. But it's like, if you look at it differently, it's sort of like, I look at it like hiking. Like you can never really be done hiking. Like you can hike today, but then there's another hike to do tomorrow, and like you can never really be the best at it either. It's sort of like you just do it. And there's a lot of things like this that he says in this book, like gardening, like
golfing.
I mean,
tennis maybe.
For some people, anyway.
A lot of hobbies, anything that's just like a recreational hobby, but like hiking is a good example, kayaking. Like you just go out and do it and have fun. You don't think like I'm gonna conquer this thing. And there's a sort of like stuckness that I think as an adult, maybe in midlife, you sort of plateau at things. And so I think about this with Wallace's writing a lot, where like, I think that he did with The Pale King feel like, was he stuck? Or was he unable to progress? So I think that the fact that you focused on that was super interesting. And then tying it back into silence, I feel like that is a huge part of what Markson is doing in pretty much all of his work after Wittgenstein's Mistress as well. Which is a lot about solitude and how it relates to silence. Solitude and straight up just loneliness, which also comes across pretty strongly in Infinite Jest. So the demand for silence, though, I mean, I'm not sure that I totally have that down. Would you mind going back to this a little bit about, like, I don't know, with metaphysics or aesthetics? I feel like I'm missing some piece of the puzzle here.
Well, what I was thinking there, it is part of this philosophical trend, really, in the second part, coming out of the first part of the 20th century, to think beyond the established ways of thinking that in the thinking of some philosophers like Derrida or Adorno, or some critical theorists, have led straight to the kind of reification and objectifications that lead to the concentration camps. So for these people, the whole civilization, in a sense, has become invalid because of what it led to in the camps. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of there. This demand for silence, this sort of inability to say something, if you will, authentic or something that is not caught up in the metaphysics or the ways of thinking that, in their thinking, really lead directly to objectification and dehumanization, right? And so then that then leads to the whole trend of post-metaphysics in 20th century philosophy. And so many philosophers really try to think how to continue philosophy through the figure of silence and ways in which we can show what cannot ordinarily be said. So even in Derrida, for example, you have these infinite permutations of phrase and returning to thought and returning to certain ideas, and by multiple ways of challenging something and making it more and more complicated, he's really trying to, I think, gesture past what he's actually saying in plain language. Even in Nietzsche, you find things like that where you continue to speak in a certain vocabulary, even though the consequences of your own thought have already propelled you beyond that. But you still have to speak within language, and language, the way we use it for these thinkers at least, is always already caught up within certain ways of thinking about reality. And so the demand for silence is maybe a demand for more authenticity and representation. Right? So that's sort of what I was thinking of there.
Well, and it made me think of a tweet. I don't know if you saw any of you saw this the other day, of someone saying, like, it's sort of a shame that no writer is really up to the task of, like, synthesizing the current moment in history. And, like, do you see some of the same parallels with, like, sort of right-wing fascism being on the rise again?
Wow, that's such a good question. I mean, what it makes me think of is actually the Engender interview that you posted yesterday, Matt, and Wallace's way of thinking about his contemporary moment in 1989, and seeing that no new way of thinking about the present had arrived. And he uses a Heidegger quote actually saying, the gods have gone away, the gods have not yet arrived, or something like that, right? Which is to say that the old ways of thinking are gone, there have been discarded, devalued, but we also haven't come up with the new ones yet. And I think this is a situation that he found himself in 89. And yeah, for sure. I mean, the whole phenomenon around Trumpism, etc., in many ways is a problem of representation too, I think, because we seem to be feeding into the phenomenon the more we critique it, right? And so that I also don't know the answer to how to do that properly, but I think that if you're on the cutting edge of your time, you probably will find yourself sort of uncertain as to how to move forward.
Well, I think it's a sense of, like, frustration, and that, the inability of, I don't know, the typical cultural critique that people, who have had any sort of academic upbringing, it's inadequate to respond to, like, political reality at the moment. When you're pressed for, what would you do in this scenario? A lot of people, I think, are finding themselves incapable of the task. Yeah. And I think that's a really frustrating feeling, and not wanting to wait until that silence, like not wanting to wait until things progress that point. But
because there's an urgency to what's happening right now.
Well, absolutely. And this is sort of the urgency I see at the center of the Wallace Nexus that I try to describe in my dissertation too, which is this tension between, on the one hand, like you said, Matt, what you call the demand for silence, and maybe as a way of staying authentic, but on the other hand, the pressing need for speaking, the absolute impossibility of staying speechless, right?
When you're writing a novel.
And you're writing a novel, so that's by itself an ironic enterprise, right? But even on a political level, like, how can you have to continue speaking, and speechlessness is simply not an option. And I think that also is a similar situation that Wallace and people like Smith found themselves in the 90s, and especially on the American scene when, the Cold War was over, and it seemed like the defining other had moved away, or was no longer
end of history.
That's right. Fukuyama writes makes that end of history thesis. So things, need some kind of self-definition in a way. So it's not enough to just stay silent. You have to speak, and that demand for speech is more pressing now than ever, definitely.
Well, and I think you get it right in your dissertation, in that the response that maybe falls most directly with writers is this indirect response, right? Yeah. It's not their role to all of a sudden swing from political, polemic to polemic. It's an indirect response that's supposed to change thinking in a way that political speech can't do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So even though it's a response to political speech, it's this other thing, which maybe you have a good name for it that I've missed it out, but something about, I don't know, humanism, it's humanizing ideas and thoughts that are indirectly related to those.
Anthropomorphizing, maybe?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And I think it also brings us back to the idea of literalization of thought that we started out with, and this idea that there's something there that fiction and that literature can do about making us feel something about abstract ideas that might not be as readily available when we read a political tract or or a scathing critique of sorts, but something that
the show don't tell.
Isn't it funny?
Because the tract will be will tell, right?
That's right. I mean, I was sort of struck by how show don't tell comes back in a philosophically resonant sense through this work. But it is a precept of creative writing workshops, right? But it has real philosophical significance, I think, and to some degree what Wallace does in that Marxist essay, I think he really charges show don't tell as a workshop mantra with philosophical significance.
That's cool.
So the minute any writer finishes a book, the first question anyone asks them is like, what are you doing next? What's next? So you just submitted this dissertation. What's next for you, Tim?
Well, I'm still teaching here at the University of Victoria, and want to turn this dissertation into an academic book. And so what I hope to do the next year...
Ever heard of Bloomsbury?
Yeah, exactly.
He's pretty into these Wallace books.
Yeah, so I hope to be able to turn the dissertation, which was written for a committee, into a book that's hopefully written for more than 4 people.
Maybe 14.
Yeah, maybe 14.
Yeah,
maybe
nice.
20. That'd be better than 4, right? But I was happy that you guys already read it in addition, so that makes it 6 at this point. That's pretty good. But yeah, that's my plan.
What are you teaching? Tell us about your class.
This is good. You're
right.
Like this.
So right now I'm teaching an intro class to just academic reading and writing, but next term I'll be teaching a 400 level course here at UVic on contemporary American fiction. So that's something that I'm very excited about, and I just put the syllabus together, and we'll be reading some of the classics. We'll be doing Toni Morrison and, of course, White Noise by DeLillo, but I've also assigned the Wallace Reader, which I think is a very handy book to teach Wallace, because I was very reluctant to assign Infinite Jest for the reason that, like we said earlier, it's just so long, and I didn't want people to jump off. And so now what I hope to do is to really make that reader the cornerstone of my class, and do short stories, do some essays, and give people an idea, and excerpts from the novels as well, and give people an idea of what Wallace is about and his relationship to some of the other people in the class. And hopefully then after that they'll be excited enough to pick up Infinite Jest and the Pale King in their entirety. That's going to be my pitch at the end of class for sure.
Yeah, totally. Like book club in the summer.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or you can do an online reading with Shazia, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, who's done it 3 times.
That's right.
Guiding. Yeah.
Well, even if you have that one Wallace book on the syllabus, be sure and send us your syllabus at the DFW Society. We now collect
great.
Into a database of everyone who's taught Wallace. And I think for people who have taught him as a sort of sampler, or people who've taught a whole course where you do read Infinite Jest, they're always interested in how to structure that.
Great.
So we have something like 90 examples now on our syllabus bank. So go and check that out, and please add to it. And this is a call not just for you, Tim, but anyone out there teaching Wallace, send us your syllabus and we'll add it to the database. And you can go and download all these other ones. I think they're actually in a Google Drive, and you can sort through them and to see how Wallace has been taught in a variety of ways. So we're always interested in more of that. But in general, I'm hugely interested in contemporary American fiction too. So please, I have to also ask you then, as someone who's an expert in this field, give us some even more contemporary stuff. Like, what is some of the best stuff you've read this year, or stuff you're excited about?
A novel I just read for the first time was Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being. I don't know if you're familiar with her work.
I have I own this book, and I've read about 50 pages of it. Thought it was amazing. Yeah. The premise of the book is incredible.
Isn't it? I loved it. I read it in a very short period of time this summer. I absolutely loved it and decided I needed to assign it. So I'm looking forward to teaching that one. That's probably the one I would mention.
What is the premise again? I think you might have mentioned this.
Well, the other night. So there's a bit of meta fiction in it, in the sense that a woman by the name of Ruth, who lives out here on Cortes Island, like Ruth Ozeki herself, walks on the beach one day and finds washed on the shore a Hello Kitty box, and in the box is a manuscript with a diary written by a young Japanese girl who writes about how she is going to kill herself. And so Ruth then speculates whether this was washed onto the shore as a remnant of the tsunami, right? And then she's trying to figure out how she can help this young, ostensibly suicidal girl. And I don't want to give it away. It's a fantastic read. I think, one of the best I've read this year for sure. And I think it continues some of the themes that I found interesting in Wallace, and it also goes into some interesting intercultural meditations on Zen Buddhism and quantum mechanics and literature in general. So it's a really good read. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Anything else? It's been good.
Well, I'm looking at your bookshelf there, Dave, and I'm looking at Lincoln in the Bardo, and I have not read it yet, but it is on my reading list next. So I'm very much looking forward to reading the new Saunders.
Yeah, it's good. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
Do you keep up with contemporary German fiction as well?
I try to.
Do you read German?
I try to. It was hard during the dissertation process, but yes, definitely.
Oh, was it all consuming of every aspect of your life or something like that?
It was more that I really focused on English fiction, and it was also that. Yes. But I just didn't.
Well, Can you recommend us like, what are people talking about in Germany these days, or like, do you know? Especially for someone who hasn't been translated into English yet, I'm always interested in any tips for that if you have any.
Yeah, I'm like I said, I'm not really up to date on what's the newest on the German scene. A German writer that I've been fascinated with is a woman by the name of Julie C. She has a couple of really great novels out there. I am not sure if they've been translated at all, but she's quite good. Yeah, Julie C.
Can you spell that last name?
Juli, and then the last word is Zeh, and her last name means toe in translation. Yeah.
Interesting.
She's
interesting. I appreciate that. That's a very selfish question, but I have to ask it. Your continuing interest in Wallace, is there any? I'm curious if you have any other sort of academic avenues to explore. Or are you looking to other horizons?
Well, one thing I want to do is extend the Wallace Nexus a bit for the book. So I'm looking
I was gonna ask about this.
I'm looking at definitely including a chapter on Tom McCarthy. This was something Jeff Severs recommended to me during my oral defense, and I'm looking at that right now. And for me personally, the reading Ruth Ozeki's book and her interest in Zen Buddhism, she's a Zen Buddhist monk herself, really made me think a lot about the East-West connection. And I'm very intrigued by connecting Eastern and Western philosophy, notions of Taoism and Buddhism in literature, and thinking a lot about that tradition. Now, that is something that Heidegger actually started in the 1940s and 50s when he started talking to Japanese monks about some of their metaphysical concepts. And I think that from an academic point of view, that might be something I might consider pursuing a little bit further. These especially the different notions of silence, aesthetics, and metaphysics in the different traditions there. On the other hand, I'm also really intrigued by a lot of the academic work that has come out recently as a part of the sort of economic turn in literary studies.
And Severs's book.
Severs's book, I think, is a fantastic example, of that. And I'm really curious about that and want to read up more. Hopefully, maybe I can put together a postdoc project on that. But thinking about neoliberalism, I think, is just something is hard to avoid in our time and age, and I'm curious how literature responds to it. And there's been so much great work on that. So yeah,
cool. So Tim, for someone having worked on this project for 3-4 years.
Yeah,
for someone having longer than that. So someone who's read your dissertation in its entirety, what's the primary thing that you want them to walk away sensing about your contribution to the discussion on Wallace?
Maybe two things. On the one hand, I think that the work of Stanley Cavell merits our interest as Wallace scholars. It really does, and people have done great work on this. Jeff Severs has done work on it. Claire Hayes-Brady has done some great work on it, but I still think we need to get more deeply into the ways of thinking about skepticism and the ordinary and metaphysics that come out of Cavell's work. And on the other hand, I still have this project of recuperating a different kind of irony in Wallace and thinking about how we can maybe still continue to think of him as an ironic writer, even though he also pens critiques of irony.
Yeah, this is something that came up when we talked to Andrew Savage on his episode. Is he's like, well, irony's not necessarily inherently bad.
That's right. I
mean, there are caustic forms of irony, which Wallace, obviously tackles, but irony is also, a great political tool. It satirizes things that ought to be satirized and made ridiculous. So it is a vehicle for political change and things like that. So. Yeah, I think we need to qualify that how we talk about irony a bit.
That's right, and I think we need to think about the question of power in terms of irony. When I heard, when Trump gave that speech a couple of days or weeks ago, mocking the testimony by Dr. Ford, and her audience responded with laughter, I thought, this is interesting. We have a form of sarcasm and irony here, but it is so embedded in cynicism and an inverse power relation that the irony itself is so wrong-headed, or the sarcasm, if you will, right? So we have to think about questions of power with regards to irony. And to me, a thinker who's really great on that is Jonathan Lear. He's a psychoanalyst and philosopher who wrote a book a couple of years ago called In Defense of Irony, and he really tries to recuperate a sort of Socratic notion of irony as a way of insight and a form of gesturing beyond our established vocabularies and ways of thinking, and I think that's where irony still really has a role to play, and in some ways that is, for me at least, the effect that I take away from reading Wallace's work as well. And like I said at the beginning of the podcast, like a book that makes me laugh but then also makes me wonder, wait, why did I laugh? What happened here, right? What is it that on the one hand is being shown to me through this affective experience of laughter? And I think that's a valuable experience.
Great. That's cool. Is your dissertation published anywhere that people can see yet? Is it out on the UVic website?
No, they put an embargo on it for a year.
Nice.
But
so
again,
you can work on publishing.
That's right. So again, I hope to make it even more readable in the meantime, and then hopefully people can check out the full book at some point.
Awesome. Cool. Do you have any other publications people can check out, or an academia.edu page?
I have a website, timpersonn.com, timpersonn.com. I have some of my German and my English writing there, and some of my music as well. And I have one review essay of Dave Lipsky's book on Wallace, which is has been published a couple of years back by Post 45. So that might be something people could read. And
cool.
At this point, that's all I have out there. But again, I hope that more is coming soon.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. And you're on Twitter?
Yes, I'm on Twitter as well. Yeah.
What's your handle again?
At Tim Personn.
All right. We'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. So easy access for people. Any sort of final thoughts, Tim? Anything we didn't cover that you were hoping to talk about Wallace in general, about your work on him, next steps?
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate being on your podcast today, and I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. I don't know if you saw it. I also gave you a little shout out in the dissertation. You're being mentioned in there somewhere.
Cool.
I really think it's wonderful, and I have learned a lot just by listening to your podcast episodes. So keep up the great work.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you for being on today, and I've really learned a lot. And I've got I printed out a bunch of your dissertation and have marked it up, so I might have more questions for you later.
Wow,
via email.
Be in touch. That'd be awesome. Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you. We've really learned it. And like even coming out of this of like, oh God, I got to go pick up that Ruth Ozeki book again.
Yeah.
I've seen that book in Defense of Irony, so I've really learned a lot. And it sent me back to the books, which is my goal for any one of these episodes. So I know that our other listeners out there will thank you as well. So let's be in touch.
Awesome. Yeah.
Dave, do we have a couple of little housekeeping things to take care of before we go?
We do. I think the primary one, and this sort of coincides with our 3rd anniversary, is that we mentioned last episode that we've been like, humming and hawing about the idea of starting a Patreon. And after a lot of discussion and how would you describe our process, Matt? I don't know. Iterations. We finally decided to pull the trigger and launch a Patreon, which we went live on Friday. So it's 2 days ago now. It's Sunday. And already, I got to say, the response has been so fantastic and humbling. And we just can't believe how generous and supportive so many of our listeners have been already, even just since launching that. So a huge thank you to everyone who's responded so positively. And we already have 15 patrons, and we set 3 tiers. So at $1, you'd be added to an email list that gives you a heads up before an episode comes out about what we cooked up, which we've never really given much idea to people about what the next episode is. So that's the $1 a month tier. At $2 a month, you get that in addition to being given a shout out on one of the episodes, the next one after you sign up, as well as we'll have a part of our website that also lists all of our patron supporters there. And then a $3 a month tier that has both of those two things, as well as kind of a periodic merchandise send out, which in the past we made stickers. There could be, various items down the road that are in the kind of the stationary type wheelhouse, or perhaps more or different stickers or other kinds of like fun things that we have kind of cooking up that will be sent out. What was the word we used, Matt? Occasionally, which could mean like, annually or maybe biannually. We'll have to kind of see how that goes. But yeah, we just want to thank 15 people specifically right now. These are the early adopters. So we want to thank especially Joel Crane, who is the very first Patreon supporter. He signed up, I think, maybe 3 minutes after I posted it on Twitter, the link. Like, it was extremely fast. And then he followed it up with a tweet that said, "Never signed up for something so fast." And so that was just like, incredibly life-affirming for us to see. So thank you, Joel, to you. We also want to thank Brian Cooper, Dennis Frank, Rob Boyce, Marianne Brow, Mark Reapy, Allison Bennell, John Notke, Andrea Lawrence L. Sheridan, who is the guest on episode 37, as well as Diego Baez, who is also the guest on episode 37. I really think that we should be paying you guys for coming on the show as opposed to you supporting us. We want to thank Jackie Reimer, Amago Vasquino. I hope I didn't butcher your last name there. This is a fun one. Bo Butler, who is the host of the Pinchin' in Public podcast, with whom we've had a notable podcast beef over contemporary American writers. I messaged him after saying that I was putting down the Trident, just going to shelf it until, a DeLillo podcast came out that we could beef with, or maybe a lot worse, like a Franzen podcast, and then I'd pick up the Trident for sure in that case.
Yeah, call me in.
Call me in. We got Tim's like backup.
I might have to go into hiding after that.
Actually, a Don DeLillo podcast would be amazing. Please, someone start putting that out. I will listen to that all the time. We want to thank Esther Zapata and Michelle Martin.
Cepeda. It's got to be Cepeda.
Yeah. Sorry, Esther. Thank you so much to you.
We love Esther.
Esther's amazing.
She's our favorite.
Yeah, Esther's presence on Twitter has been... She discovered the podcast, like 6 months ago, Matt? And binged every episode in like maybe 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, like really quick. And was so effusive on Twitter about every episode.
She's an amazing writer. Everyone go follow her.
Yeah.
I think it's Esther J. Cepeda on Twitter. Go follow her. She's amazing.
We'll link that as well. And so those 15 people, they in the last 2 days have become supporters through Patreon. I want to thank them so much. Their names will go on the website as well. And any future people who sign up for whatever those tiers I mentioned, you will get a similar shout out on a future episode. And just, I mean, really, I think that doing something like this for 3 years and putting not a little amount of time and effort and humanity into it, it just feels really like I said, life affirming and really humbling that people are excited to support what we're doing, to help with some of our costs and things like that. It's incredible.
Well, and as Tim can verify, that we need some better technological solutions for recording often in 3 different time zones all around the world. So this will allow us to get better at podcasting. I feel like we're still in the early stages of it.
Yeah, this has all been totally DIY enterprise. Like we've figured out how to edit stuff, just using like YouTube tutorials and like all that kind of stuff. So,
and by we mean Dave.
Sure, yeah, I do all the editing. So that's been my my big homework assignment over the last few years. If you want to check that out, you can go to patreon.com/Concavity show. We kept things consistent there with the same handle on Twitter and Instagram and our Gmail account. If that doesn't interest you at all, great. Nothing's going to change. We're not going to do any like exclusive stuff with our episodes that only certain people who donate or whatever are going to get. So no change there. Love you. Totally fantastic. If you don't ever go to the website, great. And of course, would you agree with that, Matt? You want to back that up?
Oh, totally. Of course.
Yeah, this is like a totally, sideline enterprise here. Of course, we always want to thank Robin O'Neill for her amazing artwork and as our podcast icon, and of course, always to Parquet Courts and Andrew Savage for their song Instant Disassembly as our intro and outro music. And I got to say, special shout out to Andrew, super cool guy to hang out with in person. We had a great time just talking about, the Me Too stuff. How do we think about Wallace in that context? He had some really good thoughts on that. Yeah, he was just a lot of fun to hang out with. He put me on the guest list for the show, so that was really cool. And the show itself was a riot. Like, it was one of the funnest rock shows I've been to in a very, very long time. They did not play Instant Disassembly, so a bit of a grudge held there, Andrew. But I'm willing to let it slide. Just kidding. No, the show was absolutely amazing. It was so fun. So if you get a chance to see Parquet Courts on this tour, do yourself a friggin' service. They are fantastic. Anything else, Matt? Any final things?
No, I just want to thank Tim for coming on the show tonight. Again,
thanks for coming to my house.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it.
And talking into this tiny microphone on
That's
my
right.
kitchen table.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Matt. It was a great chat.
Yeah. No, I hope we can continue it.
I'd love to. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again, everybody.
Turn on the white noise murmur of the AM band and the last classic rock band's last solid record.
We got an hour, 26 minutes and a half.
Sweet.
That's great. That's a really sweet.
Yeah, is that a good length?
That's a great length.
Nice.
Yeah, sometimes
we'll edit that down to about 11 minutes. We'll get it down to about...
That's our recurring joke that we say to guests after we finish, is how much we're going to butcher and then just absolutely
take everything out of
savage.
context.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.